I'm Gretchen Rubin, and I'm here right now with Crystal Ellefson, who is going to pose to me some of the most frequently asked questions about my book, The Happiness Project, and also kind of the process of other people doing their own happiness projects.
Well, I know one of the most common questions you get is, why do you think it's resonated with so many people? It was on the New York Times bestseller list for a long time, and 10 years later, it continues to sell, and so many people come to you and tell you how it changed their life.
Yeah, well, and that's something that I really wondered about, especially when I was starting, because I'm like, well, is the story of my happiness project going to be interesting to anybody? Either I'm so ordinary that I'm boring, or I'm so idiosyncratic that it's not going to be relevant to anyone else. But I think what resonates with people is this kind of this system of really trying to go systematically through it and first really ask yourself, what would make me happier? I think kind of in the chaos of everyday life, it can be hard to step back and ask the big questions and to really see where the gaps are or where the possibilities are, and then to figure out how to follow through with that. And one of the things I really focus on, just because of the kind of person I am, is things that are manageable and realistic. So I love reading about kind of extreme happiness projects, like Elizabeth Gilbert moving to I think it was Indonesia, Italy, and India, or Thoreau moving to Walden Pond. Like, I love reading about that, but that's not what I'm gonna do. So all the stuff that I focus on is really the things that people can do as part of their ordinary day without a lot of extra time, energy, or money. So it's really for people who want to change their life without changing their lives. And I think that's a lot of people identify with that. They couldn't do something big, or maybe they wouldn't even want to do something big. I don't really want to do something big, but they're looking for that low-hanging fruit for how they can find more happiness in their everyday life. And that's really how I go about it. And I think reading about what I did gets people all fired up to think about, like, oh, I could do that, or I have my own idea that I would like to do even more. And it gets them thinking about what they could do.
Well, knowing you now, it's hard to believe that you weren't always so aggressive with pursuing happiness and good habits.
Yeah.
So, but your epiphany that changed your life, where you started on the Happiness Project and then habits and everything else, clearly was a big shift. So what was your self-improvement like before you realized that happiness?
Well, I've always been a disciplined person, and a person who was able to kind of like make a plan and follow through with it. And that was really helpful when I was doing my happiness project. But what's different now is because I've really studied happiness, and I know what really contributes to happiness and what really doesn't contribute so much to happiness, that I'm much more, I think, targeted when I'm thinking about whether or not I should do something, or how important something is in my life, by thinking about it in terms of, like, well, how is this going to boost my happiness or not? So for instance, like, I really now put a great emphasis on anything to do with relationships. I always knew that relationships were important, and of course I wanted to spend time with friends and family, but now I'm like, this is a top priority. And I will often, ask myself, okay, like, knowing what I know. So for instance, a great example is getting a dog, Barnaby. So I was in the classic situation of, like, my family really wanted to get a dog. I wasn't that enthusiastic. I made a list of pros and cons. The lists were exactly the same length. So how do I decide? And I thought, well, one of my happiness project questions is to choose the bigger life. What was the bigger life? And it was clear to me the bigger life was to get a dog for our family, not for everyone, but our family. And I also knew the secret to happiness is relationships. And a dog is a relationship, and it's a completely new and different kind of relationship. And it would change the whole dynamic within my family. It would be something for a new relationship for all of us. And taking those kinds of considerations into account, the answer seemed clear. Whereas I think before I'd done all this thinking about happiness, I would have weighed in more like, it's inconvenient, it's chores, I don't want to add to my to-do list. I think I would have not been so easy to convince.
So that leads me to another question that I know people will be asking a lot, especially as they embark on their happiness project, which is, how do you know when to stop a resolution? How do you know, especially if it's, I mean, some things will be obvious, right?
Yes.
Of course, this is making me happier. So glad I did it. And other things you'll think, well, I don't know. Should I spend more time on it? What advice would you give to those people?
Well, that is a really tricky question. And I face that myself, say with something like meditation, which I've tried and given up a couple times. It's like, well, how long do you stick with something if it doesn't feel like it's getting you the result you want? And I think, first of all, the only person that can answer that is you. Like, really, what is it doing for you? And the other thing is to think like, well, just because somebody else had great success with it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to have great success with it. So am I sort of trying to convince myself to stick with it because other people keep saying how effective it is, and I'm really not, if I'm being honest, seeing any kind of results. And then sometimes we are kind of sad that we're admitting we're not the kind of person who really wants to follow through with something. Like, one of the things I'm thinking about doing is like trying to teach myself to play the ukulele off of YouTube. So I'm going to try that, but then I can imagine myself getting into it and being like, well, I'm not really enjoying this, but do I really want to be the kind of person who's going to give up on the ukulele? Sometimes it's kind of painful to admit these truths to yourself. So I think you really just have to constantly say, is this really taking me closer to my aim of a happier life? And if not, maybe I should redirect that time and energy to something else, another experiment to see if that will work better.
That reminds me of something you talked about on the Happier podcast, where you guys talked about your ideal self.
Yes.
And how people might make resolutions that really their ideal self would do, but then part of the self-knowledge will be realizing it doesn't actually fit in with my real life.
Right. So the ideal self sometimes is one like, oh, like I'm going to entertain so much, or it could be an ideal self like, oh, I'm totally going to train for the 5K. And so, or like I'm going to buy all these clothes because I keep telling myself I'm going to step it up and wear real clothes every day, but then I don't really wear real clothes, so why do I need all these outfits? So I think this is part of the happiness project, and there's kind of a sad aspect to a happiness project, I think, or I find it sad, which is really allowing yourself to admit what is not true and what you will never be, and what are the natural limitations of your nature. And I mean, on the one hand, you want to accept yourself, and on the other hand, you want to expect more from yourself. So I think we all want to push out of our comfort zones and try new things and all that. But I do think there's also the core self that you really can't ignore. And at a certain point, if you keep making resolutions that don't take that core self into account, then you're just really building a happiness project on a fantasy. And it's not going to make you very happy because it's not what's true for you. It's just somebody else's ideal, person, who none of us are.
Along those lines, what interests did you discover when you did your happiness project that have really stuck with you?
Oh, yeah, there were so many things. So one thing was children's literature. So now I think anybody who knows anything about me, like I'm very upfront with the fact that I'm this raving fan of children's literature and young adult literature. But back then, part of it was that adults didn't really talk about children's literature at all. And I truly thought I might be the only adult in New York City who loved children's literature. But I realized, and I kind of pushed it to the side or never talked about it because it didn't fit with my fantasy self, who was like very sophisticated and, very advanced reader. And then I realized, like, with the Happiness Project, like, I love this. I want to shine a spotlight on it. I want to bring it into my life more. And so I've started groups. I'm in 3 now groups where all we do is read children's literature and young adult literature. And this has nothing to do with children. By the way, many people in the group do not even have children. We talk about them, how we as adults take pleasure in them. In my house, I have whole shelves that are only children's literature. I make time every week to read children's literature. And so I really brought that much more into the center of my life. I've done a lot with technology. Part of my happiness project was starting a blog. And one of the things that the happiness project really taught me is I had always thought of myself as being not techie. And then I realized, you know what? I can do this stuff. Maybe it doesn't come quite as easily to me. Maybe I need to wait for the technology to evolve so that someone like me can use it. But I can use these tools. And same thing with a podcast. It's like, can I do it? Well, let me try and experiment, allow myself to be frustrated and insecure and scared. And then I see all the benefit that comes from it. And so now I've gotten much more excited about trying new tools and new ways to reach audiences because I feel how exciting they can be. Like scent, color, habits, there are all these things that were in the books that have continued to get bigger and bigger and bigger in my life as time has gone by.
Let's talk about the resolutions that didn't stick.
Okay.
So obviously meditation is a big one. Let's talk about that one and how you knew it was time to stop.
Well, I tried it and I didn't think it worked, so I quit. And then my friend Dan Harris, who wrote the book 10% Happier, and is like a really sensible person, and he's also kind of temperamentally, we have a lot in common. And he was so just eloquent in his explanation of like why meditation was so beneficial to him. So I was like, okay, I'm going to try it again. And so he said, like, this is almost never the case in his experience. Like, I had no trouble forming the habit of meditation because I'm really good at forming habits, but the meditation just did nothing for me. Nothing. Now, many people who love meditation will say the worse your experience is, the more desperately you need it, and you should be like doing it more and more and more. And I had to just say, I know that's what people say. I know many people have a great experience with meditation, but this just is something that's not working for me. And I would rather do something else with my time and my energy that I feel like would give me a bigger happiness boost. But it was sort of hard. It was hard to like let go of it because I had this idea of myself of like, now I'm going to get into meditation. So then I had to let go of that. So part of it, again, was this idea of identity and admitting that you don't include some kind of possibility, or that I didn't include that possibility sort of in my repertoire of characteristics.
I think that's such an important lesson that people will need to remember as they're embarking on them, is that it's okay to just learn from it
Yes.
and let go.
Yes.
And that just because everyone else has all these opinions about what it should do for you,
Yes.
it's okay if it doesn't.
100%. And it's all an experiment. And so it's like I tried things, some worked really well, some didn't work at all. And I think that's very common for a lot of people. I think a lot of times we get ideas from other people. Like we see this in the community. Like people are sharing ideas, they get excited by each other, they'll recommend, like, why don't you try this, why don't you try that? So sometimes you're like, well, somebody had a great experience. If it worked for them, it will work for me. Well, maybe it will. Maybe it will. And it's worth trying because maybe it will. And you can surprise yourself, but then maybe it won't. And I think sometimes people beat themselves up and they're like, well, if it works for Crystal and it doesn't work for me, maybe I lack willpower, I lack self-control. She's a real adult, I'm a fake. Instead of saying like, well, Crystal's a morning person. So obviously something that is set up for a morning person is going to work better for her, but I'm a night person. And so it's not surprising that we would need different strategies. Or she's an abundance lover and I'm a simplicity lover. And so the same kind of approach isn't going to be effective. So don't beat yourself up, but think about, okay, well, how could I try something else to achieve my aim? If this kind of exercise isn't sticking, maybe there's another kind of exercise.
Are there any other resolutions that you tried that didn't work out and you thought would work? Try?
Well, I try to most of my resolutions I don't involve anybody else because the only person you can change is yourself. But I had such a good experience with the weekly adventures with my daughters, which continue to this day, that I thought, well, maybe I'll have, weekly is too much, but maybe my husband and I will have a monthly adventure and we'll take turns picking a place and surprising each other, and it'll be kind of like this little thing. And I proposed this to my husband, and then he was like, didn't respond. And then I was like, okay, well, and then I brought it up again, and he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Then I brought it up again, and he's like, honey, I don't think that's going to happen. I was just like, okay, this is the guy I married. He's not into it. I don't want to like start nagging him about like
stop nagging.
Stop nagging. Yeah, yes. Well, that is a much more important resolution than monthly adventure. So that was an example of something where, like with my daughters, it was really successful. But when I tried to adapt it to my husband, like he doesn't have the temperament or the schedule where he thought that was appealing, and so I had to just let it go. Even though I think it would have been fun, it wasn't something that he was interested in doing too. And that's something I would say for people, some people say about happiness projects, they're like, well, the other people in my life don't want to do it. I'm like, don't wait for other people to participate or cooperate or be interested. My family's not that interested in my happiness project stuff, only as it kind of affects them. And if you wait for other people to be supportive or cooperative, you may never do it. And so I think for most of us, it's just like, figure out what you can do on your own and do it.
So now that you've heard from so many people who are doing happiness projects, do you find that a lot of them sound really similar, that they're doing very similar things? Are they wildly different?
Well, that's really interesting because what I see is that like a lot of the themes are the same, but then how people go about it is very different. So like one of the things is I talk about over and over again is relationships, and so the importance of connection. And one of the things, and on the Happier podcast, Elizabeth and I talked about an idea that we got from our mother, which we call Update. And in Update, we just every several days we send, like my mother, my father, my sister, and me all send each other an email, and it's called Update. And then we just talk about the most boring details of our lives. and nobody answers usually. But what it does is it really enhances our feeling of being connected in each other's day-to-day lives, and it's really very powerful. So we talked about this on the podcast, and as a kind of a resolution people could do. And what was interesting is that how people would adapt it to, maybe it's not their family, maybe it's their college roommates, or maybe it's their best friends from high school, or maybe they didn't use email, maybe they were using Instagram, or they were using, they would find, or they were using voice memos. And some people really love writing handwritten letters, and it's like, I'm not going to write a handwritten letter, if I can possibly help it. But so people take the same aim, and then they kind of reinterpret it for whatever works for them, and so I think that's great. Now, some things are really big priorities for some people, which are not important to me at all. So like travel. Travel is something for many people is like a big happiness project aim. Like they want to have more travel, whether they want to like go to interesting new places in their hometown, or they want to go to another country, or they want to like take a year off and travel. That's not important for me. To me, it doesn't really appear in my happiness project, but for some people, it's huge. Same thing, music. I've heard from so many people who are like, oh, my happiness project is to get back into practicing an instrument, or to go to more live concerts, or to listen to new music and expand like my knowledge of what's happening in music today. And I'm like, I'm just not that into music. Like, I don't need to like work that in. Or biking, or, there are so many things. Cooking is something, again, a lot of people, they're like, I want to really bring this into my life in a much bigger, more amplified way. It's not that important to me. So their happiness projects are different, but the way they go about it then is very much the same. So sometimes it's the same aim and people are using different ways to get there, and sometimes the aims are different, but then the strategies are very much the same in how they get there. So there are these commonalities in all the happiness projects.
So what are some of the most common mistakes or challenges that people make, or when they come to you and feel like I failed?
Yes.
What do you say?
Well, there's two things I think that are the biggest problems. One is when people make very general, abstract resolutions, and then it's kind of hard to know how to execute. And so you kind of have this feeling of like, oh, I know what's important to me. Why does my life not reflect my values? So something like, I want to enjoy now. It's like, well, okay, what does that mean every day? Like if you go to bed at night, have you enjoyed now? I don't know. Like who can say? Or something like, be a more loving parent. Like that sounds specific, but it actually like it's not something where you're like, did I do this today? So I think it's better. I think people have better success and feel more real change. And they also can remember it better and like put it into action better when it's very concrete and manageable. So is it enjoy now? It might be you might say to yourself something like, every morning with my first cup of coffee, I'm going to sit out on my deck and I'm going to watch the sun rise. And in that time, I'm going to allow myself to, whatever it is. Or I'm going to read spiritual masters every morning for a half an hour. Or, or I'm going to watch like a classic movie once a week because I want to appreciate like one of the ways that I appreciate now is by like taking in these great classic masterpieces of film. Or be a loving parent. It could be like, I'm going to get up earlier so I'm not as rushed in the morning. Or I'm going to plan a silly adventure once a week, the way I did. Or whatever it would be. But that's something that you can actually measure and see if you've done it. And I think that works better for people. It's easier to follow through with it, and it's easier to know if you are following through or not to kid yourself. The other mistake I make, and this is what I was sort of talking about before, is that I think a lot of times people who get frustrated or give up or feel bad about themselves because they haven't been successful in whatever aim they've set for themselves is they've really tried it in the wrong way. And instead of saying like, this way isn't working, let me try it a different way, they just keep kind of going deeper and deeper and deeper and thinking like, well, I have to do it this way. So
what's a concrete example
So
of that?
a great example that comes up all the time is people saying, I'm going to get up early and go for a run every morning before work. Now, that could work or it could not work. And I just got an email the other day from someone who's like, I want to get up early. I'm an obliger. I need accountability. I've done this. I've done that. I've done this. I've done that to give myself accountability. And I snooze alarms and all these things, and I can't get up earlier. And I'm like, why are you trying to get up earlier? I think maybe you should try to get up later because you sound like a night person who's desperately trying to change their nature. Whereas what you might be much better off is saying, how can I rearrange my life so I can get up at 9:30 instead of 7:30? And maybe my whole life would be so much easier if I just got out of bed at 9:30. Now, some people can't do that. But the fact is there really are morning people and night people. It's largely genetically determined and also a function of age. And if you're a night person, the idea that you're going to get up early and exercise or work on your novel or learn to play guitar, or answer emails, it just isn't going to, it's going to be very, very difficult for you. Whereas if you were doing that much later in the day, it might be much easier. And sometimes people are like, well, but it makes so much sense to exercise in the morning. And I'm like, if you do, but you're not because you can't get yourself out of bed. So if you exercised in the afternoon, there's a lot. And then that gets you to a different question. Because what you say is, I'm a night person, I'm really having trouble exercising in the morning. How can I exercise later in the day? A lot of people will say like, well, it's too inconvenient. I can't do it. I have to do it before work or I can't do it. So then it becomes a different set of questions, which I think are much easier to solve. So, okay, you say you can't do it after work. Now, could you get a treadmill desk where you're walking all day long? So you're not going to the gym, but you're getting constant exercise. That's better than nothing. Could you exercise in a form where you don't need to take a shower? A lot of times people could exercise, but they can't take the shower too, especially for women. It's like, I do high intensity weight training. I don't need to take a shower. You could do yoga. There's a lot of forms of exercise where you don't necessarily need to take a shower. And maybe you're going to do it during your lunch hour. You're going to use that time in a different way. Then it becomes a different set of questions that I think people can have a lot more success with, rather than just saying, I have to exercise in the morning. That's what makes sense. It doesn't make sense if it's not working for you. So, I think you have to acknowledge what's true about your nature and then set up everything to suit you, rather than trying to jam yourself into some kind of Procrustean bed of perfect resolutions.
Were there any resolutions that you set that you think were too abstract that helped you learn this, or were all of yours fairly concrete when you first started because that's just more natural to you?
Well, my method was to try to be really concrete because I knew myself well enough that I would make these kind of airy promises to myself and then I would do nothing and then I'd be like, oh, wait, I'm supposed to be more cheerful or whatever. So I really need to have like very concrete things. And the other thing about concrete that's good is it's very hard to change our emotional state, but it's pretty easy. It's much easier to change our actions. And so if you're trying to like do something like boost happiness or stay calm or be optimistic, it's hard to get right into your head. But if you change your actions, then you'll change your emotional state indirectly. But it's much easier to go from the outside in than from the inside out.
What has happened in your personal life since the Happiness Project came out 10 years ago?
Well, the biggest thing that's happened is that there was this medical treatment that was introduced for hepatitis C, because my husband Jamie has had a hepatitis C since he was 8 years old when he got a blood transfusion during a heart operation. And hepatitis C, you really do not want that. It attacks your liver, and your liver is very important, it turns out. To a happy life, you really want to hang out, you respect the liver. But a new treatment came on, and so he's cured. And so this is just like this amazing thing that we celebrate every year on January 9th. So that's a huge thing that happened. And he's changed jobs several times. That's really been fun and exciting for him. My daughter Eliza went up to college last year. That was a huge family milestone. So my daughter Eleanor had to get used to being like the only child at home, which I think she would say has pros and cons. We got a dog, Barnaby. That was a huge revolution in our lives and in our happiness. And I've written several books since then, started the podcast since then. So it's been a busy time.
So after the Happiness Project, what led you to write Happier at Home?
Well, it's funny, all the books since the Happiness Project have kind of like one has followed right from the other. So with the Happiness Project, I kind of laid out this whole framework for thinking about happiness generally. And then I wanted to go deeper. And I was thinking a lot about, well, what are the universals of happiness? And it turns out there aren't that many universals, but one of the universals is this idea of home. Just about everybody has some idea of home. So I thought, okay, well, I really want to go deeply into the idea of home and how I could really be happier at home. So I was looking at things like possessions, time, neighborhood. So it was a happiness project, but much more focused. And I started it, instead of starting in January, I started it in September because I feel like September is the other January, like right back to school feeling. And then from Happier at Home, so one of the things that I noticed as I was talking about the Happiness Project and Happier at Home and all these resolutions that I had followed, people kept coming up to me and saying, well, how did you get yourself to do those resolutions? And I would say something like, well, I knew that they would make me happier, so I decided to try them. And then they did make me happier, so I just decided to keep doing them. And they would look very puzzled and they would say, but how did you get yourself to do them? And I thought, well, I don't understand. Like, I wanted to do them, so I did them. So that was like in my mind. And then I started to think about how so many of the things that I talk about in the Happiness Project and Happier at Home are really about habits. And so it's not that I want to get more sleep tonight. It's that I want to get more sleep generally. It's not that I want to exercise, to run the marathon. It's that I want to exercise for the rest of my life. It's not that I want to give up sugar for Lent. It's that I want to quit sugar forever. And that requires habit change. So that led me to my book, Better Than Before, which is all about how can we make or break habits? How do you, if you want to harness the power of a habit to make your life happier, how do you do that? So it turns out there are 21 strategies, which sounds like a lot, but that's because some work very well for some people and not so well for other people. And so it's good to have a big menu because then you can pick and choose the ones that work for you. But in the course of figuring this out and looking at all the different strategies that work for people, I started to notice like these big differences among people that I couldn't really explain. For instance, just writing a book about habits, like I love the idea of habits. Like to me, the idea of habits is like energizing and freeing, and I love the idea of more and more habits. And then some people would like literally recoil and be like, oh, why would you want to write a book about such a loathsome subject? And I was like, that's so weird. Or like when I would talk to people about their New Year's resolutions, which I make and enjoy and think is fun, some people would be like, well, I would never make a New Year's resolution because January 1st is an arbitrary date. Like I'll do a resolution when it makes sense. I'm not going to wait for some day. And I thought, well, that's interesting because why are they all using that word arbitrary? Because the arbitrariness of January 1st never really bothered me. And that's what led me to my 4 tendencies framework, which has to do with how people fall into categories of upholders, questioners, obligers, and rebels. And when you know what your tendency is or what someone else's tendency is, it explains a lot about what kind of conditions make them happier, what kind of conditions make them unhappy, how they can set up situations to help them keep habits. It really tells you a lot about a person. It's a narrow aspect of their nature, but it's very significant.
So how do you think someone can take their knowledge of their tendency and help make their happiness project more successful?
Okay, well, that's a great example. I mean, that's a great question because I think it's really very significant. So one of the things that I talk about in the Happiness Project is accountability. And it turns out that for many people, accountability is very helpful. And for some people, obligers, accountability is crucial. Crucial. Outer accountability is crucial. But then there are rebels. And sometimes rebels, if they feel like they're being held accountable about something, it makes them not want to do it. So part of it is now I rarely say everyone should do this because I know that there are some people for whom this could raise the spirit of resistance. So for me, if I want to go to the gym, I'm like, it's much more helpful for me to be like, at 10 a.m. every Friday, I'm going to go to my high intensity weight training session. It's on the calendar. It happens the same way every week. I love to go. I go there. The person tells me what to do. I do it. Done. To a rebel, it's like, the idea that they have to do something at 10 o'clock on Friday kind of turns them off. They don't want to do it to somebody else's schedule. They don't want to do what somebody's ordering them to do. It's like the whole thing. Now, some rebels might enjoy that, but for some rebels, it could be really off-putting. So I would say to a rebel, well, let's say you want the habit of exercising because that's what you want. You want to feel vital and energized, and you love to move your body, and you don't want to be stuck behind a desk all day. That's who you are. And so why don't you join a big gym, and it's got tons of choices. And today you're feeling a little stiff, so you're going to do yoga. And today you're feeling a little restless, so you're going to do cardio. And today you're going to check out Pilates because you've heard it's great. And today you're going to do a spin class because your friend is saying how fun it is. So it's like, okay, set it up in the way that's going to appeal to you. I don't want to go to the big gym with tons of classes because it's like too many choices. But for a rebel, that could be really appealing. So again, we both have the same aim. We want to exercise regularly, but how we set it up would be very different depending on our tendency. And same thing with an obliger. Like a lot of times questioners will say to obligers, just figure out what's important to you and then you'll do it. And obligers are like, what are you talking about? It doesn't work for obligers. Obligers need outer accountability. And sometimes they feel like that's a sign of weakness. There's nothing wrong with that. Huge number of people are obligers. They need outer accountability, so just figure out how to get it. But not everybody needs it. So I don't really need outer accountability. So I don't need to waste time developing it or maintaining it because I don't really need it. But some people, it's crucial. So again, it's like you can figure out where to put your time and energy because you know what you need to succeed.
Do you hear from rebels that have done a happiness project and have any specific tips or tricks or ways that they can make it both concrete but still give themselves freedom?
Yes, well, it's interesting because you're right. Rebels are the most different from the other three, and so a lot of times what works for other tendencies doesn't work for them. So what rebels often do, first of all, rebels often feel incredibly freed by understanding kind of like that there is this, that they're part of like this tribe, the rebels, and it explains why a lot of things that work for other people don't work for them. So for instance, what many rebels have said is that something like a to-do list, which is something that works really well for me, and my whole happiness project in a sense is kind of like a gigantic to-do list, that often doesn't work for rebels. Sometimes it does, because rebels can do anything they want to do, and if they feel like it's helping them get what they want, they might use it. But for some rebels, it's more helpful to think of like a could-do list. So they'll make a list of things that they could do when they feel like it, and when they feel like it, they can do what they want. You know, they don't have this, they don't order it in the same way. Or I heard of one rebel who had a jar and wrote down tasks on slips of paper. And then every once in a while, she would just pull out one and do what it said. And kind of the gamification of it made it really fun for her. And so I think a lot of rebels kind of get in, they like the kind of the creativity and the sense of possibility that in the happiness project, but then they adapt it to suit themselves.
So after writing the Happiness Project and Happier at Home and continuing to study habits, is there anything that really surprised you?
Well, one of the things that really surprised me is the degree to which for most people outer order contributes to inner calm. And this really kind of disproportionately, I was kind of mystified by this. Now, I definitely feel it myself. Like, I do feel so much happier and more energetic and sort of more full of possibilities when my outer surroundings are in good order. And I really feel that. And but I didn't realize the extent to which a lot of other people felt the same way. And I remember a friend of mine told me, well, I finally cleaned out my fridge and now I know I can switch careers. And I was like, okay, I know exactly how she feels. And I think it's kind of mysterious though, because you're like, it's not that important. It's not that big a deal that you've got a bunch of stuff on the floor of your office, or it's not that big a deal that your car is a mess. I mean, it's not like a big deal in the context of a happy life. And yet over and over, people would say to me, this seems to really matter. And also what I know, one of the things I would often say when I speak is that of all the resolutions that I've talked about over the years, the one resolution that people most often raise to me as something that has made them happier, and it's not the most significant thing that people do, but it's the thing that comes up the most often, is the resolution to make your bed. And now there's been this whole book written about make your bed. There's something, and I was like, well, why is that so powerful? Like, what's going on there? And that, in fact, led me to work on my next book called Outer Order, Inner Calm, which is all about why is it that outer order gives us this feeling of inner calm? And even more important, because I think most people accept that, is how do you get it? How do you create outer order and maintain it over time so you maintain that inner calm that comes from it? So that book has been tremendously fun to work on just because it does feel like this. It's just strangely energized in a way that it's kind of interesting. And it's also not studied that much. There's been a lot of happiness research, which is super fascinating, but there hasn't been very much good research. And the research that has been done is often like, well, is it better to be messy or tidy? Is it more creative to be in a messy lab or a tidy lab? And I'm like, well, it just depends. It depends on you. It depends on me. Like, I need this, you need that. I'm a simplicity lover. You're an abundance lover. There's all these. There's no one right way. So to me, that research isn't even interesting. And I feel like there's a lot to be learned about how it is that our outer surroundings influence our inner state.
In your pursuit of happiness, what have you discovered about work-life balance?
Well, I never think about work-life balance because I think that sort of suggests that you could have infinite amounts of both as long as they sort of balance each other out. So what I think is I want to cram my life with the things I love. And I tell myself I have plenty of time for the things that are important to me. And what that means is there isn't time for everything. Because if I cram my life with the things I love and I have plenty of time for the things that are important to me, there's some things that just fall off and can't be done, even if I would like to do them, because they just can't be fit in. And so for me, that's been really helpful, is as kind of a way to analyze, like, should I do this or should I not do this? And what's nice about letting go of the things that I'm not as enthusiastic about is that the whole quality of my life improved, because I have so many more things that I'm really looking forward to doing or having fun with, rather than feeling like, oh, I have to do this, I have to do that, and dreading this, or being bored, or, I feel like I've got to follow through with this. Now I'm much more likely to choose the things that I'm really excited about.
So do you still do happiness projects?
Well, I had the happiness project that was like very, very structured with the happiness project. And then I returned to that with Happier at Home. But I think since I've done those two, and I've hit a lot of the big things, like I've taken care of a lot of the things that were the most pressing. So now I'm getting into the more kind of quirky things. I don't do an official happiness project the way I did before. I'm just kind of in this constant state of rolling experiments. Like, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that. Maybe this will work, maybe that will work. And one of the things, too, is because on the podcast, on the Happier podcast, each week we talk about try this at homes, which are like specific concrete things you can try at home to make yourself happier. Some of those are like big and ongoing, and some are like quick and whimsical, like write a haiku every day this week. And so I'm still in that zone of constantly thinking, like, well, what could I do? What could I change? What could I try to make myself happier? But I don't do it in that highly structured way, because I'm just sort of in this constant mode of trying and experimenting with resolutions all the time. I do think that one of the reasons that doing sort of a very systematic, structured happiness project is great as a way to start as you're trying to make your life happier is that, we all have things that are more likely to move the needle than others. Like, there's things that you can do that would make a big difference in your happiness, and things that are like, I'm not so sure that would make a big difference. So you want to put your time and your energy and your efforts into the things that are going to really give you a lot of happiness bang for the buck. And I remember talking to a guy, and I mean, this is a guy I know, and it's like, he stayed up way too late, and kept himself revved up on caffeine and sugar. He'd been talking about losing 30 pounds for years. He loved tennis, but he never played tennis anymore. He never got any exercise. He spent a lot of time sort of on low value things like, binge watching, third level television shows, late at night. And so to me, I'm like, I think you got a lot of room here to boost your happiness. And he was like, this year, my New Year's resolution is to quit chewing gum. And I was just like, man, you got to start at the top. I'm not saying
Sleep.
that. Yeah,
Exercise.
Sleep, exercise, like you say you want to read more, but you're watching all this bad TV because you're so exhausted that you don't have the emotional wherewithal or the mental wherewithal to read. And so, but you're staying up late on these TV shows because they get you addicted, and then you stay. It's like in all these vicious circles that were sort of contributing to each other. But instead of picking something and trying to tackle those big things, he'd pick this like little side issue. Now, some of the happiness researchers and habits researchers would say, like, well, if you get a little accomplishment done, that will make you more likely to start with big ones. I'm not so sure about that. I kind of think that people have a limited amount of force that they're going to direct to changing their habits and like doing resolutions. So I always think you want to start with what would make the biggest difference and move down, rather than starting with something as kind of a side project. Because even if he did successfully quit chewing gum, I'm not sure that that's going to like make him any more likely to tackle these things that I think, at least in my observation and judgment, would probably have given him a lot bigger happiness boost. And it might have been that if he felt more energetic and more cared for, he wouldn't have even felt like chewing gum as much. That might have been something that he did to try to keep himself alert, because he just was trying to jack himself up all the time because he's so exhausted.
Well, do you hear from people then on the opposite end of the spectrum that are so focused on maybe changing so many habits that they're not even really having fun anymore?
Well, that's interesting, because a lot of people worry, like, well, am I going to bite off more than I can chew? And I do think that for some people, they want to go big or go home. They're not interested in slow incremental change. Like, they want to kind of do everything all at once. And if you're that kind of person and that kind of thing has worked for you in the past, absolutely go for it. Now, some people, though, can get overwhelmed. And so one of the things I like about the Happiness Project structure is that it's set up to kind of try to get you paced. So, like, let's try a couple things that you've thought about a lot that you're really excited about. get those going. Okay, now what's something else that you're really excited about? And by kind of doing it step by step like this and really choosing very mindfully the things that you're most excited about doing, I think that gives you a lot more energy to continue. Whereas if you're just sort of like sit down like the day before New Year's Eve and you're like, okay, I'm gonna make a list of everything I need to do. I need to exercise, get more sleep, see my friends more often, plant a garden, and then it's like, they're all great ideas. But it's like, who could even tackle that? Whereas with the happiness project structure, it's really meant to kind of lead you through it in a way that makes it very realistic, very sustainable, but also all the things that you're really excited about. Because it's like, okay, you're going to pick a couple things in the month of Friends. What do you want to pick? And then most people are like, oh, I can think of several things that I'm really excited about doing. And so then you get the energy from like really seeing that change occur. Now, and one thing a lot of people have asked me is like, okay, well, do you do January's resolutions and then you swap them out for February's resolution, or is it rolling? And the idea is that this is rolling, that you're going to do something that's going to make you happier for the rest of your life. Most of the resolutions that I talk about in the Happiness Project and Happier at Home, I do them all the time ever since. And that might sound overwhelming. You're like, oh my gosh, how can I be doing hundreds of resolutions? But they make me happier, and they're just are part of my ordinary life.
They become habits now.
They become habits. They're just part of my ordinary life. A lot of them, they don't crowd out other things. It's not like I have to take an hour every day and do them. They're just part of how I go about my business. And so they really boost my happiness over the long term. And then the things that don't work, those are the ones that we need to let go of, so that there's time and effort to put in ways that are more constructive. So it is rolling, but while it can sound like a lot, I think in practice people find like it's really not. It's really not. Like giving like warm hellos and goodbyes. That's one of our family resolutions. We don't have that many family resolutions. That's one. It doesn't take that long to give somebody a warm hello or goodbye, and it really adds to your happiness. So that's a resolution that was easy for my whole family to learn to keep, because we all saw that it really boosted our happiness. But it's not like that's something that I don't have to put that on my calendar. I don't have to drop anything else to make room for that.
So do you feel the pressure to be happy all the time?
No, I don't. It's funny. Maybe I should, but I do not feel pressure to feel. I mean, one of the secrets of happiness is acknowledging when you're not feeling happy. So now, though, when I'm not feeling happy, I really try to learn from it. It's like, well, I feel really envious of somebody. What does that tell me? Or I'm feeling really angry at somebody. What's really going on here? I'm super bored. Why am I here at all? If I'm really bored by this, like, why did I sign up for it? To really use negative feelings as tools to help point me towards what would make me happier. But there's a lot of situations in life where you're just not going to feel happy, and it wouldn't even be appropriate to feel happy. So I think a happy life isn't one where people experience no negative emotions. It's just a happy life is when we're as happy as we can be, given our circumstances and our nature, so that we can have as happy a life as we can.